you're watching BloombergQuint, and I'm Menaka Doshi. We have some news coming in this evening on the standoff on GST compensation between the center and the states. This has been going on for the last 2 months. And today, what we have is a partial yet practical concession that the center has made to help the states to be able to borrow so as to cover that GST shortfall. Here's the statement that the government put out, and I'm just going to give you the quick highlights. The estimated shortfall of 1.1 lakh crore, as you know, will be borrowed by the government of India in tranches. This amount will then be passed on to the states as back loans in lieu of GST compensation cess releases. And this will, of course, facilitate the entire borrowing process, because instead of 31 states or 21 states or whatever total number of states that do decide to actually avail of this, going to the market to borrow, the center, one single entity will do the borrowing and then onward lend to the states. This is the broad, sort of framework of the announcement today. Let me introduce our guest, DK Pant, Chief Economist at India Ratings, and my colleague Ira Dugal, who is joining us as well today to talk through what this means in terms of both center state finances. Before I come to you, Mr. Pant, I'm going to get a quick word in from Ira. Ira, I think the center says that this will not have any impact on the fiscal deficit of the government of India, but effectively it will add up, won't it, to the overall borrowing of center plus state?
We'll go to Mr. Pant on that. I'll just, sort of raise three questions. One, they say that the estimated shortfall of 1.1 lakh crore will be borrowed by the government of India in appropriate tranches. It has been pointed out that they have not used the word market, but should we assume that it is market, or is it otherwise? Second, it gets passed on as capital receipts to the state government because it's being transferred as a loan. That seems fine. So it becomes a part of their financing of their fiscal deficit, which means I presume that it has to reflect on the state fiscal deficit as well, at least. But where does it go in terms of debt? There's a statement suggesting that it does not add to the general government debt, because there will be, consequent to this, lower borrowings in the additional borrowing facility that had been provided earlier by the center. But I think, it's sort of a wordplay there, because this borrowing will certainly add to the borrowing. It may be then nullified by lower borrowings from states. But we'll get to all of those technicalities. But let me throw it back to you and to Mr. Pant first.
All right. So let me then put the question to Pant. Mr. Pant, the critical question here is to try and understand, it may not add directly to the fiscal deficit of the center, but it will add to the overall deficit of center plus state, right, sir?
Yeah, because there is growth which is slowing down, and it's not slowing down, it's the negative territory in this year. There are various numbers varying from somewhere around 9% to upward of 14%. We ourselves believe it will be contraction of 11.8%. So that is going to have an impact on the revenues. Now, the situation we were looking at a situation where there will be a significant shortfall in the GST collection, both at this aggregate level, and post that how it will be distributed among center and different states. Now, till now, it was a stalemate. It was the center who was saying that states should borrow, and states were making it an effort that center should borrow. And the reason is very simple. Before we come to that, how it is going to impact is, if we look at what was said, that center will facilitate, or the RBI will facilitate these borrowings. The closest parallel we can draw for this is the Government of India fully service bonds, whereby the government identified certain institutions like NABARD, PFC, REC, HUDCO, IREDA, etc., those who will borrow from the market for a specific projects which are identified by the Government of India and on lend to them. And whatever is the debt servicing, whether the principal or the interest, will be serviced by Government of India from union budget. Now, if we look at these entities, those who have borrowed it, and look at the spread which they have paid over the GSEC of compared maturity, that spread was between 70 bips to 90 bips, which, if we look at as on today, aggregate STL spread is closer to 80 bips. Now, if that is the situation where this would have been priced, once that is priced, how that will have an impact for the 10 continuous years, because at the end of the day, it is being serviced by the cess fund. If their higher is the interest cost, the cess will continue for a longer period. So this is point number one. The second point is, it will, because it is a loan. Now, how the treatment is going to be on the center union budget, and how the treatment will be on the state budget. From the center budget, it will be a loan to the state governments, which will appear in the capital side or capital expenditure side of the government. And when it goes to the state budget, generally, if you look at on the capital receipt side on the state budget, there are many items, but the two numbers which is used for calculation of fiscal deficit is recovery of loan and advances by the state government. So whatever they have paid, plus non-debt capital receipt. So if this amount sits in the state budget as the non-debt capital receipt, then it will factor in as the capital receipt, and you will have the state government deficit going down by or not increasing because of this money. But if it comes as a loan with the traditional way of classification in the state budgets, then this amount may not come as as the total receipt of the state governments. Now, whether center borrows, state borrows, general government debt is going to remain same. Only thing what is going to happen, if earlier there was state was borrowing, but now the center will borrow. So 1,10,000 crore worth of borrowing by the center and will increase, whereas the borrowing by the state governments will go down by the equivalent amount, just because of GST, which is loss, which is because of COVID, slow growth, but not because of act of God, or the second component.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we delve deeper into the technicalities, just principally, and Menka will want to come in on this as well. This is an easier way to do it, right? Because to try and set up some sort of special window, to say that we'll facilitate low borrowing rates via that special window, that was all just, that was talk. In real market terms, it would have not been possible to do. So the center borrowing is certainly a cleaner option.
Yeah, because what if you have to, if there was facilitation by the center or by the RBI, you have to nudge investors. Practically, at the end of the day, all of us know if that happens, so you have to nudge the investors. Rather than, it's a cleaner option. Sovereign is the best borrower, and the interest cost is say as on today 590 odd or so. And if you look at the states, will have that as a 670 or 680. Now, at the end of the day, when you look at the overall fiscal health of the India, you have to look at the fiscal health, debt, and other dynamics at the general government level. So in India, we don't have exact estimate of the general government deficit and debt, but at least we can talk about center plus state. So that's a better option, whereby the interest burden on the state governments is low, and in turn, that cess does not remain for a longer period in the system, because ideally the cess was supposed to be till in the first 5 years. But now, because of we are at this unprecedented situation, and at this time we need some, what we generally say, out of box, or some kind of those kind of thinking, whereby we can minimize the risk to the system, minimize risk to the government, and minimize, at the end of the day, risk or the burden to the consumers.
Menka?
Yeah, I think we've discussed this over the last 2 months, and it's been a painful 2 months, right? The original sin, as some might say, or the biggest critique, was that this is a constitutional promise the center made to the states of compensating them for any shortfall on account of GST, GST, and so therefore the center should have borrowed and given to the states. Now, what is the situation we have right now? The center is borrowing, but on lending to the states. This is better than the previous solutions that the center has, sort of proposed to the states. Those solutions were not even legitimized by a GST Council vote. There were many, sort of concerns around those solutions. Logistically, 31 states borrowing, what yield, what would that window be? We've discussed that so many times. The explanations for that window at various points were different explanations that the center had put forward. So it would all have been very complex. The states would have had no legitimate binding commitment from the center because there was no vote in the GST Council. So on account of all of that confusion that's taken place over the last 2 months, this is definitely a far better situation. There were also those people who said that, look, what's the big deal? If the cess is being extended by a few more years to make up for the current shortfall, whether the center borrows or the state borrows, it's just simply semantics, right? This revenue line is already secured. Well, then the critique was that 31 states borrowing, what yields, what window. I think this sort of it's not the perfect solution, but it's definitely a practical solution, and I think many states will be very happy with it from the commentary we've heard over the last month or so from them.
Can I just break the seriousness of the discussion and the conversation with, this seems like a little bit of thoda tera, thoda mera. Chal, main borrow kar leta hu, teri books mein dal deta hu. But that's an entirely facetious comment.
No, it's not facetious, actually. Sorry, Mr. Pant, please finish, and then I'll tell you why it's not facetious at all.
Yeah. That brings back a major question: is that 14%? How that 14% was arrived? So we did some work based on whatever the aggregate data, and we found out all the taxes which are subsumed in the GST from the state side. They had grown at exactly at 13.98. We rounded off at the 14% CAGR for 5 years prior to GST implementation. But the kind of growth we were seeing at that point of time, that is totally missing. So if we would have worked on the basis of buoyancy, suppose it had shown a buoyancy of 1.1, nominal GDP growth of 12%, your GST taxes subsumed in GST is 14%, 14 by 12, you get a number which is somewhere around between 1.1 and 1.2. If you have worked out on the basis of 1.1 or 1.2 and fixed a minimum, like in whatever may be the situation, there will be cess GST compensation will be at least equivalent to the previous year, then we would not have seen this situation. Now, even then, though the compensation is for the 5 years, have we worked out a situation like next year we don't see this kind of situation, because it is unlikely that all states will grow at the same pace. So there will be some state here and there where the compensation demand may be higher. So have we threshed out those things also in today's solution?
Well, I don't think they have, right, sir? I think had there been two months of negotiations, maybe because this shortfall will likely occur next year as well. And at that point, will the compensation commitment still be at 14%? Constitutionally, yes. Or rather by law and combination of constitutional mandates. So, yeah, I mean, these 2 months could have been spent negotiating all of that. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It is where we are. But at least we have a better solution today than we did have over the last few days. And Ira, you weren't being facetious at all, because one state chief finance minister told us on record that we are willing to find a compromise solution where the center, borrows a little bit, we borrow a little bit. We understand it's extraordinary times, but the center has to be willing to come to the negotiating table. It's just thrown its hands up and said, we will not borrow. Now it's your problem. So I think maybe, today is a resolution of all of those issues, right?
Right, absolutely. Mr. Pant, I had a couple of questions also on the treatment. So you detailed some of it, but I wanted to understand it from the center's book side. You're saying that this would be comparable to fully serviced bonds. That is possible, and that's certainly a thought. And if I'm not wrong, those fully serviced bonds were still being shown below the line. I remember a debate
No. No, because what happens right now, we are in in a situation or in time where only the interest component is there. So
Okay.
under each ministry, there is a line item where there the interest amount is there. So for particular entity A, B, C, or whatever whosoever is borrowed, so they are not below the line item. Yes, if you look at that particular year's fiscal deficit, the absolute amount was not there, but what happened is from the subsequent year when the debt servicing starts, so the interest will start will be paid from the next year, or maybe on the 6 monthly basis, depending upon the terms are generally it's 6 monthly basis. So the interest cost is part of central
Yeah.
expenditure. But that particular year, you are right. That was for that particular year, it was same as whether erstwhile oil bonds or fertilizer bonds or food bonds.
So they are technically correct in saying that this borrowing will not add to general government debt. It will not be on the center's books. It will not be on the state's books. But practically, that's not a feasible situation, right? It has to be somewhere.
It will cancel out. So what will happen from the it's a typical the double entry system. So on the center side, it will be loan to the state, and on the state side it will be the receipt. So when you arrive in the pure sense, the general government, because the numbers are so minute and so detailed, so generally what we end up we enter at centers deficit and the state deficit and come out with the general government deficit. But if you look at Indian public finance statistics published by, I think, DEA, Ministry of Finance, they do this compilation where these entries are netted out. So it should not be part of the expenditure at two places. It should not be the part of income at two places. So those entries gets cancelled out, and you get that number. So this particular, let's talk about 1,10,000 crore as of now. What we are talking about. So 1,10,000 crore will be the borrowing by the central government, but you can always say these are for the specific purpose, and how that will be treated, I think by the time we have maybe a couple of days we will have more clarity on this. So it will be loaned to the state, and on the state side they will take it as the on the capital receipt. I was expecting this as to be as a grant on the revenue side. But since this is going on the capital side, so it is not going to it is going to do is your revenue deficit will get bloated by 1,10,000 crore. But when you talk about the fiscal deficit, because this entry is going to sit at the capital receipt, and if it is sitting on the capital side as the non-debt capital receipt, then only it will enter. Otherwise, the rest of the borrowings which state does or which center does, they are not taken in the calculation of fiscal deficit, because most of the people are well versed with the central budget as a glance. So you have recoveries of loans and advances, and then the non-debt capital receipt, which is generally disinvestment. You take only those two entries while calculating fiscal deficit. We don't take into account the borrowing and other liabilities, which are nothing but the fiscal deficit.
Menka?
Yeah, I have a question to both of you, and that has to do with what this means for state spending. I think most states announced their budgets much earlier in the year, and at that time, this was around February. Let's assume that they had worked in a compensation at 14%, right? Now, today we're talking about the center borrowing 1.1 lakh crore, which is not that 14%. By the center's own calculation, that 14% would have been 3 lakh crores as compensation to the states, of which they estimated they would collect revenue of about 65,000 crores. So the shortfall would be 2.35 lakh crores. So there is still a wide gap between 2.35 lakh crores at 14% and 1.1 lakh crore. I just wonder whether this will, either states will have to borrow on their own to be able to make up for that shortfall, or they will have to cut back on expenditure depending on what the market response to their borrowing is. Mr. Pant, how would you read what impact this might have on state expenditure, especially in a year like this, which is so extraordinary?
Yeah, so there are many options with the states. Not the options not in the good sense, but because they are forced to the wall, and there is not revenue is not coming the way it should have been. Now, one option is, if you look at in the past, and there's a plethora of literature across the globe. Whenever the fiscal adjustment process takes place, the soft target is your uh, capital expenditure. As we see in the post global financial crisis, we had some 23 or 24% contraction compression in the in your capital expenditure. So that is one. The second, the states have deferred some amount of their expenditure. So it was unheard, unseen, and unimaginable that state government will say, we are deferring your salaries to their employees. Like the central government has freezed the DA is not going to increase for next year and a half. The same is happening now. What is going to happen is there will be some sort of cut in the capital expenditure. There will be some reprioritization of the expenditure, and always there is a lot of there's some amount of buffer which is generally these budgets keep. So having seeing these budgets from a long time at the both at the center and state level, there'll be the many new schemes which were announced both at the center budget as well as the state budgets. And since first 4 months or so there was nothing, it is unlikely that most of these, unless they are related to health, unless they are related to livelihood, or unless they are related to schemes such as Manrega and all those which are increasing employment or giving employment to the people, it is unlikely that most of these schemes will start. Now, your
Mhm.
question is 2,35,000 crore plus 65,000 crore. 3 lakh was the crore was the shortfall which was estimated, out of which 110 plus 65, 175 is taken care of. Now,
Right.
in fact, so there will be a mismatch or lesser revenue of to the extent of 1.25 lakh crore. Now, precisely for that reason, when you look at how the state borrowing, which is increased from 3 to 3.5 to 4, 4.5, and 5%, and we had seen some states have achieved few reform measures and they have been allowed. But my bigger worry is, as of now, the central government is giving this share of central taxes to the states based on the number which is there in the budget. And this has been the tradition. Once the budget is presented, from there you have the divisible pool, and from there every month the money is being transferred to the states. And it is only right at the end, when the revised estimate is presented, then only that adjustment takes place, and that adjustment takes place in the month of March. April 2020 was a very difficult month. Now, when government presents their budget on 1st of February 2021, and the way the growth is going to behave will have its impact on the revenue collection, whether it's the corporate tax, income tax, and other taxes. What is going to happen at the end in the month of February and March? That time there will be a lot of adjustment. So I think some of the states will be keeping some buffer or keeping some amount of debt available, or borrowing lines available to them, so that they can make use of that, or keeping some sort of buffer, whether they will keep their entire WMA and OD lines free, so that at the short notice with the liquidity situation they will use it. But they will be because what we have estimated is the state deficit aggregate is going to go up to 5% of the GDP, and which, if I look at those 21, 22 states whose budgets are available, it was somewhere around 3 odd percent. So there is roughly around 2 odd percent, and 2 odd percent, you even if you go to the 2 lakh 11,000 crore worth of deficit at the GDP number, a nominal GDP number 2% will give you the number which we are talking about, some 40,000-50,000 odd crore additional deficit by of the state governments.
Well, that's a
Maybe I'll
useful.
just make one last point and then throw it to you.
I did. In fact, Ira, I did want you to also weigh in on. By then, hopefully, we will also know a little bit more about RBI's state OMOs, right?
Yes, so they have to give out a plan, but there's just so much addition and subtraction from this state borrowing thing, right? Because at the end of this press release, they say that the borrowings will not increase because the states that benefit from this special window are likely to borrow a considerably lesser amount from the additional borrowing facility of 2% of GSDP under the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Yesterday, we had seen the states who had accepted option 1 get an additional 0.5% conditionally. So there's just so much addition, subtraction going on here that I think the final numbers that you will go by will be what eventual borrowing happens at the end of every quarter. And I think those will be the only eventual reliable numbers. And yes, the RBI has to come in with this OMO plan and how they intend to, operationalize it. But certainly this facility being taken away to the central government will simplify, their life to an extent. Because presumably that special window that we have been talking about, where there were all sorts of possibilities thrown around of letters of comfort and all sorts of stuff we've discussed, presumably that's off the table now. This special window is simply the government borrowing, although it has been pointed out to me, maybe by conspiracy theorists, that they have not used the word market borrowing yet.
Okay, I'm going to close it here on a lighter note. Ira, you set the tone, so I'm going to do this. I'll thank Mr. Pant for joining us, but I did post a picture of a window for you on Twitter because you and I have spent so much time discussing this special window and trying to figure out who's extending or opening this window and where and how the states are going to borrow. We have resolutions, so today I gifted you a window picture. And on that note, thank you very much, Mr. Pant. Ira, as always, thanks. And thank you very much for watching. I hope we've explained so beautifully as Mr. Pant has what the numbers stack up to be and what this concession by the center will mean. Thanks for watching BloombergQuint.